Hey there, everybody. This is Jay Frost speaking to you from the home office as usual, and welcome you, of course, to the Philanthropy Mastermind series brought to you by our friends at DonorSearch. We usually don't mention much about them except to say that we're grateful that they provide a platform for letting great speakers from the field share their knowledge with us. Today, you may hear a little bit more about that because we have been fortunate to actually bring somebody from within that world of DonorSearch to present. But his experience extends far into the field. You may know him from his work over the last decades. And if you don't, you're going to learn a lot about it today. So we're grateful that you can come and make time to learn a lot about surveys. We know that it's going to be a good crowd here today. And I want to encourage all of you to make use, of course, of the chat. So you can go in there. In fact, it'd be a very nice thing if you'd let our guests know that you are here. Just go right into the chat and say hello if you would, and where you're from, maybe which institution you're with. Feel free to warm up that area so we can use that throughout. That's your sandbox to play, so please do use that throughout. Thank you very much, Mark. Appreciate you getting that started for us. We also have, of course, Q&A. You know what that means. That's the place where we want you to ask your questions so we won't miss them in the chat. So please do start posting them there throughout. And then at the conclusion of the presentation, because there will actually be one today, lots of content to share, we will make sure to mine the Q&A for your questions. And I'm sure that Dan Lowman, our guest today, will be happy to share his knowledge about those issues with you. Usually we do have two questions, which I'm going to address right now. The first is, can you get the slides? And I'll let Dan tell you whether or not he's going to be sharing those, and I'm sure that we can get them to you right away. You can see he's nodding.
You can have the slides.
You can have the slides. The other thing is that, of course, we always make a recording of these sessions, and we place them over at DonorSearch website at donorsearch.net. under the resources tab. They're also over on YouTube, but you're going to find it most easy to find them directly through the DonorSearch site, along with all the other sessions, our webcasts, our CFRE credit earning sessions, and our podcasts are all there waiting for you. So I hope you'll take advantage of those. So with that, what I want to do, of course, is turn the baton over to Dan because he told me not to introduce him. He's got a slide that will do that. So Dan, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Jay. I don't think he rehearses these introductions, and they always go perfectly without a single stutter. It's amazing. So I'm going to jump over to my slides. And I'm a data guy, so I can't have a conversation without a data slide. So there's a few of them. Jay, can you just confirm that we're able to see everything?
We are.
Okay, wonderful. So I want to talk about surveys today, and we'll get into the nuts and bolts of that in just a minute or two. And in the introduction, in the summary of the presentation today, we talked about back to basics. This is funny from a guy who currently works in artificial intelligence to predict donor behavior to talk about going back to the basics. But surveys have been around for a pretty long time. I mean, let's remember that Joseph and Mary went to Bethlehem to be counted in a survey, we're still doing them today to find out valuable things about our constituents and our donors and the people that are important to us as development and advancement programs. So in some ways, it's really simple. If you want to know what people are thinking, let's just ask them, and we can often get an enormous amount of information. So what I'm hoping to do today through a pile of slides with a bunch of data on them is a couple of interwoven stories. One is I want to be able to show you a couple of examples of surveys that you can probably implement on your own fairly quickly that solve specific problems, where to put prospects, how to qualify prospects, things like that. And then I also want to talk about some things that I've come across in survey reports over the years that I've worked on where we got some surprises or where we learned something at a strategic level that might help all of you get a little more knowledge to help you make decisions about your fundraising programs. And they're kind of mixed and mingled. I wanted to change it up a little bit as we went through, and I'll pause when I get through each of those sections and have a chance for Jay to let me know what's coming up through the Q&A. So if you've got questions, don't feel like you have to wait until the end. Please go right ahead and put it in the Q&A, and we'll get to it as quickly as we can. So a little bit about me. I am born, raised, and schooled in Chicago. I'm a data guy. I've spent 94.6% of my life with a Chicago address, and I felt that that qualified me for that actual non-stick-on tattoo that I have on my right shoulder, which is the Chicago flag, if you're not familiar. Um, I went to school at the University of Illinois at Chicago, of course, here in town, great school, where I studied statistics and social science research methods. And then I promptly threw all of that knowledge away and joined the Peace Corps, where I spent nearly 3 years in the Slovak Republic, which was a terrific start to my professional life. And I have been blessed to have been able to travel a lot through work and road trips and other kinds of things. Work has taken me to all 50 states. I've been to every single place in the Johnny Cash song. I've been everywhere. I had to make a special trip to get to Crater Lake, Oregon. And I get to use the word circumnavigate. I circumnavigated the globe. I left Chicago and headed east and came back around to Chicago, crossing every longitude line on the globe. And when I was about 25, I started working at a fundraising consulting firm, and we were doing work that at the time was kind of on the cutting edge of what's now widely available wealth screening and predictive modeling. We were the first to have a fully web-based screening product, integrating single name lookups with large batch files. All that stuff was new and pretty cool, and I'm pleased to say we set the standard for the products that are around now. After a number of years running that area, I co-founded a subsidiary company called Survey Lab, which, as the name implies, is all about survey research. And our mission was to get serious about fundraising surveys, have comparability, benchmarking capabilities, productize stuff so that people could get plug and play donor experience surveys, things like that. Really a great experience. And we did a lot of cool work, some of which you'll see in today's presentation. And then last year, I made the jump over to DonorSearch, specifically its artificial intelligence arm, which we call DSAI. And the best explanation I can give for why I decided to make that move is the same one I tell my mother, which is I wanted to do something cool. I really wanted to get back on the outer edge of what we're doing in terms of predicting donor behavior and making the fundraising process more efficient and successful. And it's been a great transition. So let's get into the good stuff. So as I said, I have kind of two goals. One is surveys that you can implement, and then surveys that you might get some kind of high level findings. This one's a little bit of both, and it's about donor recognition societies. So the backstory here is a university asked us for kind of a milquetoast survey about perceptions about acknowledgement and recognition benefits associated with donor societies. We were expecting people to say they liked the newsletter, they didn't like the newsletter, that they appreciated these online video events or whatever it happened to be. This was a place with a pretty strong participation rate. This is, they have a strong sense of pride. It's a great school. And we got a little more than we bargained for in terms of what the survey turned over, in terms of the information that we got back. It was not what we were expecting. So I blinded this because the names of the gift levels are related to the school. So you just have level 1 through 9 here. But we asked the question, which donor society are you a member of? And 70% said, I don't know. And 15% said they were not members, even though they were. And a whopping 12% got it right. So the short answer is, without going into all of these numbers, that 88% of people who are in a giving society at this prestigious university have no idea which club they're in, which also suggests that they may not care, but we'll get into that in just a moment. Now, if we ask how much money you gave in the last year, people were much more likely to get the answer right. In fact, only 3% said that they didn't know. 50% got it spot on, and 82% were right within a range, one or the other, above and below. So bookmark this in your head. They don't know what level they're in, but they are thinking about how much money they're contributing. And this starts to get into how we can come up with some next steps and recommendations for what happens in these donor recognition societies. But a couple of other fun slides first. Asking the question, I'm aware of the giving levels that differentiate each level. 9% said that they knew the answer to that question. Even among donors of $25,000 or more, it actually went down to 7%. 2% said that they understand the benefits come with their level of giving. So think about all the energy that you might be putting into the benefits associated with gift levels and keeping things straight and administratively sorted. That 98% of people who are part of these programs are unaware of what the benefits are. And again, a whopping less than 1%, which I think given the response rate here comes out to about 2 people, said that the ability to advance in levels within the giving society impacts my giving at the university. That comes down to pretty much no one saying that it's a motivator. And as my little note to myself says, these results are unambiguous. Sometimes people say that they don't want to be part of a special club to advance in giving levels, and that's a valid observation of how people who make charitable gifts sometimes talk about the recognition that they may get. But this is less than 1%. Even if we were wrong by tenfold, it would still mean 90% of people are saying that advancing levels is not important to them. So this is a really strong takeaway for me that a lot of these programs are perhaps overwrought, to put it in simple terms. So we dug into what are the various ways in which donors are recognized for being part of these programs. And you can see that in the top 6 by percentage, the top 6 benefits, nothing really stands out. It kind of floats around 1 in 4 respondents saying that these were meaningful for them. There's not something that really jumps out as something that's particularly positive. Some of them are pretty easy to put together. Items I can wear or display with pride, a personal thank you message from the institution. Some are a little bit harder to organize, perks while visiting campus, dinners near where I live, those kinds of things. But still, only 26% of people said that receptions or dinners near where I live were very important to them. And this, again, presents an opportunity to maybe thin out some of the energy that's going into putting these programs together. Down at the bottom, the permanent listing on a plaque and an annual listing on a plaque are the primary differentiators of the top levels of this institution's giving societies. And they rank effectively dead last, single-digit percentages saying that that's meaningful to them. And it turns out that most people just don't care. Next, we asked, when you think about other organizations, how meaningful is each of these benefits to you? And finally, we get a standout non-negative response. Almost 3 in 4 respondents said that hearing about the impact of their giving is very meaningful to them. And a little more than half said that being thanked by those who benefit most directly from my gift is very meaningful to them. The next big oval down there, floating around that 25% mark, like on the previous slide, it's interesting. They're kind of similar, that things like items I can wear or display with pride, an opportunity to attend exclusive events. The same percentage of people who were talking about it at the university are saying that those are important to them at other organizations they support. Only 9% said participating as a member of a recognition giving society was important to them. Now, that's not nothing, which is to give away a punchline here and say, I'm not yet advocating for abolishing giving societies. We do have to recognize that it is important to some people and it's a marketing opportunity, but you're still talking about 90% of this population saying that it's not particularly important to them. So I'll say what the big bullet point says: donors give to make a difference, and they want to hear about that, and they appreciate some gratitude, but the club itself is not a motivator. And let me just highlight this again. 71% of the respondents of the survey, which was well over 1,000 people, said that hearing about the impact of their giving was meaningful to them. When we asked these donors about their experience as a donor, kind of the same way you get a survey from United Airlines after you get off a flight, asking how the cabin cleanliness was and the flight crew and all that. This is asking a series of just quick questions, scale of 1 to 10. How did we do on these measures? Understanding the impact of my giving, ranked dead last at about a little less than 1 in 3 people at this particular institution saying that the university had done a good job communicating that information. So people want it, but they're not getting it. And they're not clearly not getting it through the Recognition Society program because it's just not delivering the value at the donor level that we'd like to see. Oh, I'm not going to read all this to you, but there's a couple of highlights here, and this is where we took the results and turned them into some recommendations. Recommendation number 1, maybe you don't need 9 levels. Maybe we could cut this down to 3, 4, 5 levels, which will make things a little more administratively manageable and less stationary and less specific benefits and website updates and things like that. The evidence is pretty strong that the current program isn't working. And I'll veer from my written points here for just a second to say this is where surveys can come in really handy if you're trying to prove a point, that particularly at this institution, but at lots of places, donor recognition societies become part of the institutional inertia. They're very hard to get rid of once they're in place because people feel that they're important, and people meaning within the institution or the organization. And the survey results here can really convince leadership on down that maybe we've been making the wrong decisions based on our instinct when the data doesn't support it. The middle section of this, starting with examine marketing and promotion of the societies, this to me was the most important recommendation that we made, which is stop talking about the benefits and start talking about the impact. If you're in the $5,000 to $10,000 club, we should be talking about what your gift does and what your gift combined with other people at your level is doing in the aggregate at this organization to make a difference. That's what people want to hear. There's all kinds of ways to present that, and I'll leave that to the marketing and communications folks. There's a lot of great ways and a lot of not great ways, but getting that word out appears to be the single most important thing. And of course, you just won't need as many cordless screwdrivers, even though I think I own 4 of them, because you don't need to move all those plaques around. So let me take a pause and see if we've got some questions about this section before we move on to the next one.
And Dan, I do see that there are a couple here. One is indicating from Dale that this study is on a university and asking about how this might apply to environmental, human services, and other nonprofits.
I think that's a great question. And this is where I'll confess that I've done a whole lot of work in higher ed and less work in other areas, but not nothing. I think that the conceptual issue of talking about impact over benefits is going to be true across nonprofit organizations, particularly advocacy organizations where people are giving directly to support a cause and not necessarily out of loyalty or positivity or personal connection in some ways. I'll talk more about that in another section. I think that the investment in donor recognition societies and other kinds of organizations, in fact, might even be more dramatic than we're seeing in this university setting. I hope that answers the question.
We did have another question. It's kind of parallel from Mark, who is asking if higher education was a part of the survey. You've clearly answered that, but also saying NCAA Division I athletics, that kind of narrowness, but that's a very different world. Was that also something that you've encountered a lot with athletics, and any similarities or differences?
So in the surveys we've done of donors that give primarily to athletics, they're again, I'll get into sort of like emotional versus engagement drivers in a couple of slides. Donors that are narrowly focused on athletics have different relationships with their institution than donors to other parts of the program. So we see more transactional giving, and that those gift levels and the perks that come associated with those gift levels drive a different kind of interaction. And given that, I would say that if donor recognition societies with benefits work under certain circumstances, by all means keep them, but just let's try to minimize the amount of effort that we're putting into it relative to the benefit that we get.
We had a couple more. Should I just tee them up, because you may be addressing these issues as you proceed? Should I just
Sure,
share?
let me know what's coming.
Okay, so one of them was from Laura, who asked about how involved the customer, in this case the university, was in creating the survey. And the other one, quite different but interesting, is what are the notable differences in the way that women and young alumni might have answered these questions?
You saw the one I skipped right over. The client was very involved. Our process, and if you work with any firm to help you produce surveys, you should make sure that you're closely involved and that you're not getting something pulled off a library shelf. So this was a highly focused survey on a very specific situation. So we didn't have prefab questions that we could apply to this. So we went back and forth quite a bit, and there was some sensitivity around how we framed the questions so that
I don't want to hear it.
Oh, appears we have somebody else in the room. Dan, sorry, let's see if I can take care of that right now.
That's okay. And then on the question of women and young alumni, both women and young alumni, for example, said that having items they can wear with pride were much more highly rated than we saw when we looked at the population in general. Things like perks on campus, young alumni were particularly interested in. Are we ready to move on?
Go right ahead. I'm going to see if I can take care of that in the meantime.
Okay. I have kind of two sections in a row that are meant to be practical, things that you can probably do fairly quickly, that you might be able to implement yourself without having to go outside and solve some specific problems that are pretty consistent across many organizations. So my example here, we've got a university with a pretty big database, and through a well screening process, they had identified 13,000 or so undergraduate alumni with high wealth ratings. They were undergraduate alums, so their degrees were in philosophy, psychology, anthropology, and they were probably not working as anthropologists, even though that's where they were kind of tagged in the prospect assignment process, because there wasn't a lot of other data in which to make decisions about assignments. So again, to put it bluntly, to try to find out where they were today, we decided to ask them where they had their interests. So some of these kind of zoom ins here, I have some bigger versions of them on subsequent slides, so you don't have to squint. But through the screening process, this place identified about 10,000 unassigned households that looked pretty good to them. That's big, and I want to emphasize that it's all relative. If you're joining us from a smaller organization and you're the fundraiser, if there are 100 people that meet any of these criteria, or even 25 people that meet these criteria, it's still probably more than you can easily handle in terms of going out and qualifying them in the traditional sense of having a gift officer try to set up that kind of meeting. So while this one's big, it applies across the board. This is the first of a couple times that I'll say this in the assessed column. We wanted to understand some emotional factors, their feelings of relevance to the organization today, or the relevance of the organization to them today, feelings of pride, loyalty. And it turns out that if you don't have those kinds of emotions, you're very unlikely to support an organization. But there's a lot of people who have those emotions that still don't support an organization either at all all or at the level that they could. So it's kind of a prerequisite that you have these positive emotional factors, and I'll get to what the other differentiating factor is in a bit here. So we asked questions around those relevance questions, loyalty questions. And then it got kind of cool where we asked, are you interested or not interested in 16 different topics? And there are things like animals and current events and performing arts. And if you said you were interested, the screen blew up a little bit and gave you more finer detail points. So in performing arts, it offered dance, music, film, theater, etc. And you could indicate your strength of interest in a particular form of performing arts in that example. And I'm going to hit home on this a couple of different times, but we gave people the chance to kind of raise their hand and say, yes, I'd like to meet with someone, which might feel a little bold, but trust me, it works, and I'll show you. So this is just one of the zoom ins. People saying that they feel very connected, which is a strong indicator of positive feelings. This is the zoom in on selecting particular areas of interest. And qualification surveys get into specific interest areas, and that answers a question that we struggle to deal with a lot of traditional qualification exercises and prospect research, where we can't know what's going on in somebody's head. And we know where they graduated 30 years ago, but we don't know what their passions are today. And while a survey won't answer this for every person, it will answer it for the people who take the survey and can really help you drill into current interest areas. So in my theater example, these are real results from a real place. 328 people out of that pool said that they had high interest in theater, and they considered theater as one of their top 3 giving priorities. Not theater at this institution, just theater in general. Only 11 of those had graduated from a performing arts program at the university. So over 300 people said that theater was their passion. And you can imagine that the department chair of the performing arts program was absolutely beside herself with joy. And the poor development officer who'd been chasing prospects around the undergraduate college for years said, wow, here we have hundreds of potential prospects that aren't heavy, consistent donors to other parts of the institution that we can now move into a qualification process. Raising the question for those of you who are in the world of what do you do next with prospects is what's next. We've just handed one gift officer 328 pretty good looking prospects. What do you do? So let me pause again and take some questions. And if anyone has comments about what would you do next, I'd be glad to hear them.
I'm looking to see if there are any comments that have come in just now, as well as a couple that were queued up before, Dan. From the ones that came in before, I know that we had a comment from Karen comment and question that hearing about impact of their giving ranked highest, does it matter for retention who the communication comes from?
Yes. And the shortest answer is from the people who benefit most directly from the gift. Mm-hmm. I did a project at, I guess I shouldn't say their name. It's a public university that has a very strong geology and geophysics program. And they have a spring, seniors in their spring semester go on something they call the Big Dig, where they go out to a geologically interesting place and do what geologists do. And they were all handed by the development office a stack of 10 postcards, and they were to write a personal message to other geology graduates saying, we're on the Big Dig. It's a great experience. I'm sure you remember it just like you were here today from, when you graduated in 1962. It's donors to our program make this possible. And that had this enormous impact in terms of acquisition and upgrades for annual giving. I think people really do want to hear from who's getting the money. And I think a lot of our communications do focus on presidents and board chairs. Most donors can't even name the president or the board chair of most of these organizations. So I think making it personal really has a lot of value.
Yeah, it's again echoing what you said before, which is, stop talking about the benefits and start talking about the impact. Do you mind a follow-up question on that?
Please.
I know that there are institutions, in fact, one of my alma maters will send out a letter, and it will be addressed to me, perhaps, and it's written from the point of view of a student, but it's clearly a note that's going to all the alumni. And so it's saying essentially, thank you all for your gifts. And it's addressing me, but it seems clear to me as a reader that it's really something that they're sending to everybody who's made a gift. Is that as impactful as the kinds of impact expressions from a student, from a graduate that you're talking about?
I went to a session at a conference once where the session title was Annual Giving. How do you write a love letter to 10,000 people? Mm-hmm. And given the technological capabilities now to personalize things that are printed and sent out in emails and customizing the language and things like that, I wouldn't say customize everything down to the smallest detail, but the more personal it comes across seems to have a greater impact on those positive emotions about feeling pride and loyalty, and I do think it matters.
You had a question also from Dale, who had said, how did you decide the precise wording of the questions in the surveys? Did you ask the same question in different ways to validate it?
Good question. When we created Survey Lab, we hired some really smart people who knew more about surveys than I did, and we did a combination of kind of best practices around survey questions to avoid double-barreled questions and leading questions and things like that. And then we did do quite a bit of testing, and it was sort of an ongoing process of what's the best way to phrase these questions to get answers that seem to be predictive of other kinds of behavior. Now, that said, it's not quite as important as companies like Survey Lab would want you to believe. That you can, with a couple of smart people in your development office, you could probably come up with a pretty solid survey. And as long as it doesn't feel like it's steering people in a certain direction, you're probably going to come out okay.
You may have addressed this when I was checking on the audio issue we had a few minutes ago, but I know this will come up again and again anyway, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on response rates. That's what Laura was asking about. What should be expected, and maybe differences in response rates according to the different populations you're addressing or the institution types?
Sure, it's all over the map. In a higher ed setting where you've got very strong sense of institutional pride, lifelong believers in the organization, we sometimes saw response rates in the 40s, 50% range. I mean, really kind of through the roof sort of stuff. At larger organizations that have less direct contact with their donors, advocacy groups, animal welfare, things like that, the numbers were sometimes lower, but they were usually in the teens. So we pretty consistently got response rates between 15 and 20%. And every now and then we'd see something lower than that, but there was usually a backstory.
We also had a question here that relates to GDPR and privacy. And I'll just read it verbatim because I want to make sure I give it to you exactly as intended. Do you think GDPR and other privacy regulations have impacted communications with donors, particularly for organizations that work internationally? And if not, how do you see organizations balancing between needed communications and privacy considerations?
So I'm going to punt and say I'm not an expert on GDPR. To the extent that I can talk about surveys, it's opt-in. So surveys are something that organizations that are operating in Europe and the United Kingdom are using surveys as a way to legally and ethically work within the confines of GDPR. But in terms of the larger issues, I'm too far out of it that I would hesitate to give an answer without sounding ridiculous.
And I think that's it for now.
Okay, we'll keep moving. So this is related to what we just talked about with just a little more detail. And I'm going to skim through some of these introductory slides because we just talked about the need to qualify constituents and need better data to help identify constituents with capacity and likelihood to give. Surveys are great donor and prospect research. It comes right from the source. And it presents an opportunity to ask people these questions about their feelings of affiliation and their level of engagement and how it compares to other places that they support. And that's difficult to find through other sources. There are some limitations. One of them we just hit on, which is that everyone you send the survey will not take the survey. Most people who get the survey invitation won't take the survey, in fact. So it doesn't solve all these problems, but it does create a pipeline. And people like to be heard. So the survey can act as a qualification tool in and of itself. Just by sending it out and saying we're interested in your opinion and we want to hear from you is a way to tell your constituency that you are listening. If it's a well-written survey that's not clearly a pitch for money, by the time you get to the end of it, you can really have a strong engagement tool at your disposal. Another nice thing about surveys is you can reuse them. You can test it out. You could send it to 500 people and see what kind of response you get, then tweak it and send it to another 500 people 2 weeks later and see if you get changes. Unless you're doing academic research, the goal here is to identify and qualify prospects, not to write white papers. I had mentioned this earlier, and this is, I think, the second of 3 times that I'll mention it, that feelings of positivity, loyalty, and connection are very strong predictors of potential giving. And as I said before, if you don't feel positive, if you don't feel loyal, your odds of making a gift of any interest or significance or at all is very low. And the real differentiator is you start to see it on the connection bars here. Donors at higher levels say at a much greater level that they feel connected to the organization, where donors of less than $1,000, only about a third say they feel connected. So that's the real differentiator. You have that prerequisite emotional set of drivers that you have to contend with. People have to like you and want to be part of your mission, but you have to let them under the tent. Through communications, through personal interactions, through any of the ways that you interact with your constituency. This is part of a report that was much longer. So rather than walk you through the actual data slides on here, just stick with the big text. Perceived engagement is more important than measured engagement, and engagement scores have become a very popular and justifiably so mechanism for starting to measure the ways in which people engage with your organization. CASE has defined what they look at in terms of engagement scores. A lot of organizations are working hard on their own, but when it comes down to it, there are people who volunteer and call prospective students and serve on committees, and they may say that they're moderately engaged. They may be comparing themselves to people who are even more engaged. And then on the other side of the room, you may have someone who carries the tote bag from your museum proudly around everywhere they go, and has the annual membership that they've had for years, and they go after work every Thursday and go through a different gallery, whatever it happens to be. They're not showing up on the same radar in terms of their level of connection, but they feel deeply connected and engaged to the organization. So this is where a survey comes in a way that we can't measure through the database necessarily, which is how engaged do you feel? Just put that on a 1 through 10 scale. And people who say 10 may not show up on your list of the highly engaged, but they feel that way, and that's what's critical. I'm just going to skip over a few things. So what I'm skipping over are just a couple of other questions that we asked. This is from a longer version of the prospect qualification survey, and it asked a bunch of questions. So do you read the alumni magazine? Do you come to jazz at the aquarium? What's your what's your population of pets living in your household? A lot of different things that we can start to uncover. And a lot of data comes out of that, which can feel a little overwhelming. So we created a composite score, which is a very fancy way of saying 3 of us sat around a conference table and said if they feel very positive, we'll give them 5 points. And if they feel not at all positive, we'll give them 0 points. And we repeated that with all the questions. It was not particularly scientific, but it worked. We wound up with pretty sizable numbers of people, even at donors at the less than $500 level, who scored very high on the survey. They were saying everything right that we would think is consistent with donor behavior. And that then allows us to prioritize where we want to put our human and non-human digital strategy and things like that. Imagine a bunch of data nerds running into their boss's office with the chart of that, where we got almost a perfect bell curve. In statistics, this is called a witch's hat because it's got the peak instead of the nice curve. But you can immediately start to pull out people who scored high and then throw in some other filters that they are unassigned, that they have made gifts in at least 2 of the last 5 years, whatever, that they're affiliated with programs that don't have a natural constituency necessarily, anything like that, and start to move them into your qualification pipeline and use the data as a way to really drive things forward. Last thing on this section, just 2 quick things. One, go for it. Ask the money question. Are you willing to talk to someone about philanthropy and engagement opportunities? There's different ways to ask this question. I've actually become an advocate of not giving no as an answer choice, because once somebody clicks no, you've kind of closed the door. So I'm a yes and maybe at a later time is the 2 answer choices there. But people do say yes. They're raising their hand and saying, I want to talk to you. And if a gift officer doesn't know what to do with that, then you need new gift officers. And then second money question, without fail, if you can, ask about inclusion in the will or estate plan. Some real easy next steps come out of this one, that if they said yes, go in the database and see if there's a documented plan gift in the system. If there's not a documented gift, get the plan giving people on the phone to get that documentation, and your campaign counting numbers go right up because you just got these new plan gift pledges that you've documented. For the people who say I plan to or I'm undecided, again, let's get the plan giving people into the process here and start to talk to them about opportunities or communicate with them through printed and digital materials. So let's take another quick break for some questions before we jump into what's nearly the last section.
Okay, let's see. We had a question from Alexander who said, what is the correlation between people who are survey respondents and those giving an increased gift?
People who, that's an excellent question. Loosely, meaning it's not that strong of a correlation, people who give more answer surveys more often. There's probably a trust issue that's going on there. But people who take surveys do in subsequent surveys where we've done kind of pulse surveys, the same survey at the same place, 6 months apart, that kind of thing. There is a greater retention rate and an acquisition rate, usually at lower dollar values, not at the major gift level, but we see it in the annual fund.
We also had a question from Dale who had asked, is there a site you can point us to that has a set of best practice survey questions?
Google it. There's some good stuff out there. But if you Google fundraising surveys, stuff comes up, and there's some chat sites where people have put their own information. And I should say I am no longer affiliated with Survey Lab, so I don't have any stake in this game. But there's good data out there by Googling fundraising surveys.
If you heard me laughing, it's because I heard Google and my first thought was, well, maybe this is a job for Chat GPT, but and people love it or they hate it, or maybe a mix of both. Have you used things like that in order to design survey questions in addition to brainstorming with your team?
No. I'm a little old school, and I have my textbook from college and a couple updated versions of it, and that was the rule book that we lived by in creating questions. You got to remember ChatGPT and other kinds of really kind of interpersonal artificial intelligence like that, things like Alexa and Google Maps are relatively new. I'm not sure that I would quite yet trust existing artificial intelligence to write questions because they're very personal questions about people's feelings and their finances. I would want to have a close eye on that.
Right. Well, and there's another point here that Dale had made earlier. It's not really in the form of a question, but it's an interesting observation, something that's come up a lot in the series, which is that, to quote, the biggest challenge for nonprofits that Dale has spoken with is where to put the survey answers into the donor's record to their responses so they can be easily used for customer email and direct mail. But this also gets into that idea about how to utilize that data, maybe even collectively, all the free-form natural language data. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, certainly for questions, well, I should say, we made a real effort to minimize free text questions because it's very difficult if you have particularly a large survey to comb through them. We did a big survey for a major state university, and we got back something like 14,000 free text responses to a question. And I wasn't going to read 14,000, so we kind of had to read every 15th one and try to make some judgments. There are products on the market now that do a better job than they used to. There's a survey company called Qualtrics, which has really good natural language processing that reads the responses and categorizes them into positive, negative, and keyword categories and things like that. But I do think responses can be loaded into most donor systems. That's a reason to have your survey not take 20 minutes to complete, so you have enough fields to import that into the system. And I'll come back to the idea of the composite scoring. You don't necessarily need to load every single piece of data into your donor database. You can load the composite score and a couple of key things like what's on the slide right now.
Mm-hmm. I think that's it for now.
Okay. So this is back to the kind of strategic high level things to think about as you think about your fundraising programs. And I have talked about it on like 6 different slides, and now here finally it shows up. We asked what's called here Institution A to rate the importance of 8 drivers, was the term we used. 4 were emotional in nature, and 4 were engagement in nature. And it was on a 7-point scale from 1 to 7, where 7 meant it was very impactful in your decision to make a gift, and 1 that it was not at all impactful or important. And just to show you the low and the high, the first thing we looked at was, did the campaign itself have, what impact did the campaign have on your decision to make charitable gifts to the institution? Only about 13% said that it had a strong impact. Now, that ignores the fact that the campaign is a marketing infrastructure, right? That's what campaigns are. So they may have been motivated by communications and promotion that they had encountered without knowing it was campaign related. So I don't want to belittle the value of campaigns, but the fact that there was a campaign was not a driver to the vast majority of respondents to this survey. Now, loyalty, on the other hand, was much, much stronger. The campaign, the mean score out of 7 was about 3, and it was almost 6 on the loyalty side. So loyalty was the most important single reported driver. And reported, I say, because this comes back to people are not always 100% honest with themselves or with the survey about what they expect in terms of recognition and acknowledgement, and they feel a sense of pride in saying they're giving out of loyalty, which is a valid response, but it may not be the whole picture. We did some statistical wizardry, and you can measure if multiple values kind of travel together. So sorry for all the streamers on this chart. I got a cleaned up version on the next slide. But the 4 engagement drivers, involvement in the community, access to leadership, advancement staff, and the campaign itself, are grouped together and in the survey response, and they travel together all the way till you get to principal gift donors, where community involvement kind of drifts up above one of these others. But that pack of 4 engagement drivers are related statistically. And the same is true for the emotional drivers, affinity for an area within the organization, loyalty, the impact of the gift or belief that the gift will have an impact, and gratitude. And they're even more tightly bound as they move together. And this also comes back to, you have to have these positive emotions to be a donor of really any size. But if we want to move the needle on moving toward major gifts, we really have to have a strong engagement game and get people involved, let them feel that they're engaged. I don't have the slide for this one because it's not really about the survey, but the single greatest predictor of people who felt strongly engaged was the number of visits they had from a gift officer. And if you're ever feeling down about the role that a gift officer plays in moving a mission forward, that one slide should tell you everything, that we can't do it without people in the development office moving through the relationship building process, because it turns out that is the single greatest predictor of engagement, and engagement is the single greatest predictor of significant giving. For the statistically nerdy, the middle of each of these rectangles is the line of best fit from the regression analysis. I won't say any more else about that, because if you care, you understood, and if you don't care, you don't have to worry about it. But you can see just by the angle of the lines that engagement has a much more rapid rise in terms of its in terms of its relationship with giving level, while the emotional states are a little more even. Let me stop with one final point, and then we should have some time left for additional questions. I had some interns, and they wanted to work on a project that was related to people like them, and that is current college students or recent graduates. And they surveyed about 500 people who were either in college or had recently graduated. They were all between 20 and 25 years old. They got about 500 responses. It was a short survey. And one of the questions was something along the lines of, does your family make charitable gifts? 55% said yes, 45% said no. And if you look at the bottom bar charts, we asked the next question: how important is it for you to make charitable gifts? If your family makes charitable gifts, or if you report that your family makes charitable gifts, nearly 80% of those students said that making charitable gifts was important to them. Where if your family does not have a reported history of making charitable gifts, only 30% said it was important. And this is just a great slide to talk about around the conference table, but it also, in my experience over the years, we spend a lot of time trying to activate non-donors, particularly in membership organizations and in education, where you've got people who have an affiliation but aren't necessarily anything other than ticket buyers or alums or something like that. And that energy may, because I really have no idea, we may be trying to change a personal value trait that's a learned trait, that if giving isn't something that's happened historically in your family, no matter what we say, it may not be that we're saying it wrong, it may be that we're speaking to someone who's not speaking our language in terms of charitable giving. So I raised that as something to think about. I hope I get a question or two about it, because I could talk about it all day, and I'd be interested in your take on its meaning. So that is my formal presentation. I'm happy to take any comments, questions, return to anything, whatever you got, throw it at me.
Okay, Dan. Well, so first of all, thank you so much for this. And people who have been to the series before may know that we, for the webcasts, we often don't have this kind of instruction. So we're really grateful that you could share all this here. And I believe that you said that you might be able to return later in the year, maybe share some of this, and we could even offer this as a CFRE credit earning session. So just to let everybody know, this was just a bonus that Dan was willing to offer. You can bear to hear it twice. Well, I'm sure you'll have more to share, because there's a lot more, and there are a lot more questions I'm sure that'll come in that you can address as well. And we'll jump right into those now. I also just want to give a reminder for those who have to rotate off as we get to the hour mark in 7 minutes, that a recording of this is going to be available for you over at DonorSearch.net, which you can look for under the resources tab. And in fact, if you look in the chat, you'll see I've provided various links so that you can access this recording later. And also, you'll see a follow-up email come to you with a link to this material and probably a link to those slides as well that Dan promised. So please be on the lookout for that. You can share this with colleagues who you need to get on the same page with you as you go and survey your constituents, your friends, your loyal donors, and others. We have right here a question that came in earlier from Alexander, who said, do you think there's any validity differences between emailed, mailed, and personal interview survey responses?
Yes, is the short answer. Scratch mail, that snail mail is, people don't respond to them. They're expensive to produce. They're expensive to gather the data. There's very, very little value in mailed surveys. I can make a case for doing some of them, but for the most part, no. An emailed survey, I think you do get pretty solid honesty, but you run into spam filters and crowded inboxes and people not wanting to take 3 to 5 minutes to answer a survey that they may suspect is about fundraising anyway. In-person interviews are great, but they're different. On the negative side, you get what's called response bias, where people say what they think you want to hear, and not necessarily how they actually feel. But on the other hand, you can read body language, you can develop a personal rapport. To the extent that it's possible, focus groups and in-person meetings are definitely the way to do this. And I should have said this at the beginning. Surveys are a way to leverage resources that are not immediately available to you. No one has enough gift officers to go qualify everybody that should be qualified. Literally no one does. So this is a mechanism to get out and try to get to some wider reach.
Right. And by the way, that was Sandy, I should have said. So thank you very much for that, Sandy, and thank you for being here. We have a question from Ryan, friend of the show and friend of all of us here, who says, I've heard that people are more likely to say, I will give, than they are to actually make the gift. Do you have experience showing the difference between intent and action? For example, percentages. And have you asked people how much they will give and then compared the amounts later to see if there's a standard difference?
That's a good question. Let me answer it indirectly. I wrote a book about a year ago, and to get it out of the house while I was working on it, I drove a little bit of time with Uber, and it was the best job I ever had. It was truly fascinating to drive around Chicago in an Uber late at night. But the real world called, and here I am again. People who said they were going to tip in the app almost never did. It's that response bias where you want to avoid a difficult conversation, and I think if you ask people to make a gift and they say I'll give, some of them have no intention of giving, but they don't want to say no to you to your face. I don't have percentages on that, but it's a widespread issue in any kind of survey and social science research, so it's something you have to consider.
We had a question here about, let me see, students and family giving. Has there been any research into the effect of charitable non-monetary actions on the importance given to giving?
Like volunteering? Is that how you interpret that?
That's how I would interpret it.
Okay. We know from some of the other, in this presentation, that engagement is a huge driver of downstream giving. So people who volunteer, who come to events, who participate, there's a lot of different ways that your organizations create opportunities for engagement. They're not all going to give, but by as I keep saying, letting people under the tent, as they start to see what you're doing, their motivations to make charitable gifts increase. And there's strong evidence of that. And when I say it's a learned trait, whether or not you give, that's not quite fair, because the 55% whose family makes charitable gifts probably have not been giving since the Mayflower. And at some point that became part of their family culture. And through strong relationship building and good communications, you could move people on the 45% into the giving is important category.
Heather had said, I'm intrigued about any classes or certificates on donor behavior and more the psychology of giving. Any ideas? And I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Dan, but there are some people out there offering courses like that. Adrian Sargent, who's been in the series, among them.
Jay, you know more about this than I do. Take it away.
Well, I know that there are different classes offered both in the United States and abroad on this, especially about psychology. And one program is run by Jen Shang and Adrian Sargent, and they have courses on the psychology of giving. We'll look and see if we can have them. We haven't had the pleasure of having Jen Shang here, but we've had Adrian before, and hopefully we can get them and other people who are specialists in this area to come back. You may also be interested in the raw research work on areas like this being done by the people at Arnova, which is affiliated with the Lilly School. They do exceptional work.
A plug for a colleague of mine, Nathan Chappell, who works at DonorSearch AI, just published a book through Wiley Publishing called The Generosity Crisis. And Jay got it on his bookshelf.
I was going to go grab it, but I'm
he's resisting. And it focuses on the shift in how charitable gifts have been made by individuals over the last 50 years or so. And it really does point out some crisis level concerns that are going on in nonprofit organizations. And the subtitle of the book is The Case for Making Radical Connections. It comes back to engagement, that we got to bring people inside.
Right. We had another question from Elizabeth, who had said, are you using email surveys for collecting aggregate, whoa, things are moving fast now, info on populations or on individuals? And if individuals, are people aware how you are collecting their info? This is kind of an interesting twist on the privacy consideration.
No, that's a good question. Different survey providers have different points of view on this. When I was at Survey Lab and the survey work that I do consulting on now, we were in the camp of very transparent honesty. So the invitation explained why we were doing the survey, how long we thought it was going to take, what the topic was, and how the data was going to be used. And we frequently, although not always at client request, put in an opt-out where you can have my data, but I don't want my personal information connected to the answers. I feel strongly about that from kind of an academic perspective, but it's there in the United States, there's no real rules guiding it.
Oh, I also want to make a point to the chat, because there was continued discussion about behavioral science and so forth in the psychology of giving. And in addition to Nathan's book, which I hope everybody's putting on their shelf, which is, again, The Generosity Crisis. And we've had sessions on that subject in this series. You'll also find a session by Bernard Ross, or Bernard Ross, as he calls himself, I should say. That was also in the series. So you'll find both of those over at DonorSearch.net under the Resources tab. And I have a link to that in the chat, not to specifically Ross's talk, but to the place within the Resources tab where you can see recordings of that and all the other sessions we've had in this series. So as you're thinking about all this and we're wrapping up, Dan, what's really the word of inspiration that you give to people who see all this, they know they need to do it, but they just have never done it. They just couldn't get around to it. What is going to be the tipping point for them? How can they go back to their office and their colleagues and say, now is the time?
The first is have a reason to do a survey. Don't just do a survey to do a survey. And think about what the research objective really is. Is it about identifying prospects? Is it about donor recognition societies? Is it about committee organization? Or I've done some cool surveys on alumni magazines. Turns out people love the printed alumni magazine in 4 colors, even though we think we've moved to all digital. Mm-hmm. And then sit down, lock your door, take 2 hours. That's all it'll take, and write down 10 questions that get at that. And then from there, bring in your colleagues and edit it up. There's nothing about particularly the prospect qualification and identification surveys that you can't do yourself with a SurveyMonkey account. You just want to make sure it meets your brand standards and looks good, reflects you well.
Well, I can't thank you enough for this, Dan. And if people want to reach out to you, learn more about what you're doing these days, talk to you about survey work, how can they reach you?
My contact info is here if you want to jot it down really quick or take a screenshot. You can also just find me on LinkedIn, which my notifications are turned on. So if you message me there, I'll get back to you by email.
And for those who either can't see this or are listening to this or watching it later and it's a small screen, that's again Dan Lowman, solutions architect at DSAI, that's DonorSearch AI. And he has a phone number there. I won't bother to read that, but I will tell you it's dan.lowman, Lowman, at donorsearch.net. Thank you so much for this, Dan. And you really can find him on LinkedIn, because even though we are colleagues in this this environment, that's, I think, how we started talking about this. So do reach out to him there or follow his work. I want to thank all of you for hanging out with us today as well, and encourage you to join us this Thursday. We have Lawrence Pagnoni coming in, the founder of Lapa Fundraising, who's going to be talking with us about strategies for nonprofits in a changing fundraising landscape. That's going to be on Thursday at 3:30. We also have a new podcast that just dropped this week with Jennifer Oyer from Hawaii. You'll be interested to listen to that episode about her adventures in giving and philanthropy. And there are sessions coming up next week that are also CFRE accredited. So I hope that you'll join us for all of that. You'll find all of that listed at the DonorSearch site at donorsearch.net. And while you're there, in case you're wondering why we keep mentioning this company, it's not only because they're generous enough to give us the time and space to have people like Dan work with us and teach us, but also because they know a lot about the people who fund the work that we do. So if you're interested in your donors, I sure hope that you are, I hope you'll take a look at what they have to offer, maybe click on a link, have a discussion. But in the meantime, enjoy yourselves, take care of yourselves, and we hope to see you Thursday. Till then, take care.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dan.